I just wanted to sort of refocus the conversation to what we're trying to achieve here, which is giving everybody something they can stick in their back pocket and take with them in their everyday life in order to better contain frustration, better to basically have a civil conversation and not be screaming at the radio every time they turn it on. So let me ask Linda then this question. How do you have a civil conversation when one of the participants' content is based on concepts gleaned from various experts, like talking heads found on a variety of media, that this person has taken as truth, coming practically from Mount Sinai, meaning like, Moses with his tablets. 15, not 10.
Why would you have a conversation with someone who,
Well, we all have to have those conversations with those people, though. So what do we do when we have to?
Well, I go back to, I guess, thinking about, well, why are you having this conversation? So it's someone at work. And they just mosey by your cubicle and they start spouting all this stuff. And so at that point, it's not a conversation. It's a diatribe. Is that the word? Anyway, so I would find a way to stop them. Hold on a minute. I'm really trying to understand what your point is, or I really want to understand what your beliefs are. And how can we do that in a way that I don't feel like I don't have any participation in this conversation? I would like both of us to have a chance to talk. So how can we do that? And for the most part, I think if people are upset, if they know that you have a willingness to listen to them and you approach it in a way that shows empathy, which we've talked about, and shows an intention to keep the relationship intact, that person is likely to be willing to settle down. And we talked about ground rules, I think, at one point in time, and that you could have an agreement between the two of you. Okay, well, we can talk about this, this, and this, but this one is really hard for me to hear, hard for me to listen to. Could you just not talk about that specific thing for right now? And could we just talk about these other two things? So you sort of begin to weave your way into a conversation where you both have an opportunity to share in that information.
So another question we have here is, how do you maintain civility when you're being attacked? Now, most people in their average day-to-day life going to Price Chopper and to work, people aren't going to attack you on immigration, okay? But Casey, you may have this issue. People do attack you because you write editorials.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy the fact that maintaining an even tone just drives them up the wall even more. I hate to say that because that might seem aggressive, but
I think being disarming is great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Right,
and you think about that?
Absolutely. I do like to think that at times I can be funny, and I think that is just naturally disarming. It's really tough I think it's tougher to, if the person you're talking to is self-deprecating, I think that will usually work as to reduce the pulse of, or at least the heatedness of such a conversation. But it's not easy. And I've been in conversations, I've been in press conferences with the governor, where you will feel, it's very easy to feel like you are under attack. You've been in those conversations too, many times.
sort of,
Yeah, and
you want the world to suck you in.
yeah, right, where you can feel your throat kind of tighten up, and it's difficult, you know. I don't know if that helps at all.
What is the influence of the deliberate dissembling of public education where young people used to learn critical thinking? Is that disemboweling of public education, I think is the word, where young people used to learn critical thinking. So this is, right off the bat, we know this person thinks that public education not doing a good job right now.
So we have a problem, we do, in public education. I think it's coming from a variety of places, underfunding, certainly classrooms are large, teachers are being asked to do a lot more than teach in our schools, and often are also counseling and parenting and doing a lot of other things that are in some ways diluting what's happening in the classroom. But I think we also have to look directly at testing, right, and high stakes testing. Because I just had a daughter, she went through public schools in a not great place in Northwest Georgia. So, you know, this was not a well-funded school system. And so firsthand, I could see that, and I see it also with students coming into my classrooms, particularly as freshmen, that they know how to memorize things for 2 days, right? But to make connections between those things, or to really understand why they're learning them, or to retain them, and I think it's in particular the making connections and thinking critically, we do have a problem there. And you know, I don't necessarily think that four-year private colleges are the solution universally and unilaterally to that problem. But we really, I think, do need to, at some level, address as a society, where are we going to bring this back in, if it's not in our public schools, where we get beyond just, can I answer the questions on the test tomorrow, to, hey, we learned this 6 months ago, but I still need it, I'm still using it. You know, this is not just learn and forget, learn and forget, learn and forget. And I think that does contribute in a lot of ways to why it's difficult for us to agree on a set of facts, why it can be difficult for us to have context for the conversations that we're having, because we're becoming more and more, in my opinion, a sort of information-free society, right? Despite the fact that we have more and more information at our fingertips. It's at our fingertips, and you know, it's not here.
Do you think that that the loss of debate teams in high school and college, what we used to call forensics for some reason in my high school, is that contributing to our inability to, you know, articulate on the fly?
They're still out there. I don't know if they're what they used to be, but I've got a friend of mine who's in Montana whose son is a champion debater, and he described going to DC to the national competition, and he said it was incredible. So
I'm glad that they're still there. They're important.
Yeah, they do exist. The institution where I previously was for 20 years had a national championship winning forensics team, but it's very small, right? And so this gets to one of the things that really worries me about civil discourse in this country, is that we don't really have models anymore, right? Models for how to do this. We don't see it on television, we don't see it, we don't have the big Oxford-style debates. So where do we learn? We don't see it anywhere.
It becomes almost style over substance, like Crossfire.
Yeah.
Scott, on facts, this is for you. How do you have a conversation with someone like Alex Jones of InfoWars, who doesn't believe the Sandy Hook school shooting really happened, that it was all staged and fake?
Why have such a conversation? I mean,
Well, obviously people are listening to him.
but you know,
Like the president.
I guess I got, you know, life is short, the earth moves on an axis, and you have to make decisions how to deploy your energies and assets. And I don't believe that any human being's objective should be to prevail in a conversation. I think that is a fool's errand. I don't think that the likelihood of someone saying, Eureka, I think that smart money isn't on that. So my view is that you have conversations with people when you want to strengthen bonds, even if you have different perspectives, and maybe move closer together so you can learn from each other. But when one is at such a polar extreme, and I'm not saying deranged, and I'm not saying that his facts are or not true, it's irrelevant to me.
How can you say it's irrelevant?
It is irrelevant.
His facts are not true.
Wait, when Alex Jones says that Newtown never happened and those families and children are crisis actors, you don't think that's a relevant fact?
If you know, I used to be a prosecutor, and they started me, I wasn't very confident, so they started me the complaint room. And people would come in, and they'd say, Mr. Fine, you're the prosecutor. Hey, there's a Martian on top of my TV set. And I didn't know what to do. I knew that's unlikely. I couldn't rule it out. And so what I would do is and I learned to do this from my predecessor, you take a matchbox and you put aluminum foil on it, and then you take two bulbs and you screw them in. There's no battery, and you say, sir, we've had this problem. This is a common problem in this area. If you put this device on top of your TV, it will ward off the Martians. Now, going with your gut, many of you will say that's inappropriate, that's horrible, but it just goes to my personal point, which is sometimes you get a sense that engaging is not worthwhile, and fabricators, if they are fabricators, will run their course. They will have no traction in the long term and use your energies on other things.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I completely and utterly disagree with you. I think that one of the purposes of civility is to do exactly that work in separating fact from fiction. And I agree with you that fabricators will run their course, but they will do a considerable amount of damage, not just to civil discourse, but also to individuals. I covered Newtown. I went down there the night of the shooting because the Hearst papers in Bridgeport, Connecticut were basically doing an all-hands call for people to come down. And I got down there that Friday night and listened and took, transcribed the police recordings. And then the next day I went to Newtown and ended up hanging out with the press pack and doing a story basically on the media horde that came into the town. And it was a haunting experience. And Susan knows Freeman Clopo, who for a long time was a reporter for Bloomberg, and I saw him there, and Freeman, I think, actually got to speak to some of the families of the victims, and it is the only time I've ever seen Freeman Clopo smoke a cigarette. And the families that have been the victims of Alex Jones's bullshit, and that is a term that I use in the philosophical sense. I'm using that in the philosophical sense, and I can't remember the philosopher who wrote the very small book called On Bullshit, but he's a serious philosopher, and he basically, his argument is that there are truth and there are lies, and there is a third quantity, which is bullshit, which is deployed by people. If you tell the truth, you believe the truth you are telling. If you tell a lie, you recognize that you are telling something that is the opposite of the truth. You recognize that you have stepped over the line. But bullshit, the person who produces bullshit just doesn't care. Doesn't really care. And I think that Mr. Jones falls into that category.
Casey, I don't disagree at all with what you're saying, but you're a journalist. Your job is to observe the social condition and comment on it.
No, that is not what my job is. That is part of what my job is, but the primary job of journalism is to record the facts to the best of our ability, with as much humility as we can bring to it, to tell the best version of the truth we can. It's not to observe the social setting and comment upon it. That's the job of, I don't know, an essayist or a novelist, or perhaps somebody like Tom Wolfe, who was a very good journalist, but was also a social commentator. But I'm sorry I interrupted.
I was wondering what that meant, but I'm sorry you interrupted me. I can only speak for myself. There are horrible things. People are saying horrible things and doing horrible things about the environment, enforcement, immigration. There's a whole spectrum of issues. The question is, when do we personally engage, and with what intensity, and what degree of certainty do we have to have about our position? I'm not trivializing by any means school shootings. I'm simply saying that we are not obliged to. We can. You just look out there and you say, this person really bothers me to my core. That person is a moron. And it's okay to do that individually. We are not obligated to engage on every assertion that's speculative.
What is the system that will bring, that looks like it will succeed in bringing Alex Jones love?
What is it? What is the system?
It is the tort system. It is your field that ultimately, I believe, will be the end of him. Because the lawsuit, which is one of several lawsuits that have been filed against him, I hope they absolutely destroy him. I hope they absolutely pin him to the wall.
I understand that, but my point is, and we've got to be careful here. I share that desire, but we have crazies, we have Holocaust deniers, right? We have people who do not believe that climate change is the product of human activity. I think that the body politic is the best jury. Things may accelerate it. You may have
how will the body politic take care of Alex Jones?
They ignored him.
I got news for you. He's got a huge audience and millions of dollars in revenue every year. I don't know how the body politic is going to take care of him. It is going to be truth-telling, separating fact from fiction, and also the tort system, which is another way by which we separate fact from fiction that will ultimately, I believe, be his undoing.
Do you mind if we hear from, I'd love to hear what Linda has to say about this very conversation, which is an excellent conversation.
I agree with both sides. I'm right in the middle of the river. I think it's really important for people who spread those kinds of lies to somehow be called out on them. But I also believe that I, as an individual, if I have someone in my life who is so ingrained in something that is just so out there, and I know that there's really no chance of opening up the door for that person to think differently, I probably would step away from that conversation just because I only have so much energy in my life. I mean, I meditate, I read spiritual things, I try to get myself ready for the day and go into the day with peace, but sometimes it doesn't always work. So knowing when to walk away from a conversation, I don't think is a bad thing, if it's not my responsibility to make a difference. Lara?
So just a couple things. Goes back to a definition and defining our terms about civil discourse, because I think Casey and Scott are talking about two different things. There's truth-telling, which is not always civil, right? And then there's something else. which is maybe civil discourse where you make concessions and you say, I understand where you're coming from, etc. But, so I think, you know, in terms of how do we engage with the bullshit, right, is maybe not always civil, or there's different ways to go about that. But I do think, Casey, what you're talking about is really about the failure of Mill's metaphor of the marketplace of ideas, right? So John Stuart Mill says that the way that we find truth is everybody brings their ideas to the marketplace, and we test them and we try them out, and the ones that people don't buy go away, right? And then the idea is that the ones that people buy are more true, and we refine truth there. And the problem is exactly that not everyone in our marketplace of ideas today has equal access to the marketplace, and some people have money that is amplifying their message, and other people can't get a word in edgewise, and so we're maybe not going to find truth in the way that we used to by exploring. And this is a problem for higher education as well, this idea that we all come together and we share ideas. Well, does every idea get a shot, right, at the marketplace? And it raises another question of whether every idea should get a shot as well. So yeah.
Do you, okay, so this is the question I wanted to ask you, Laura, which I think goes really well with what you just said. Is there any value to actually understanding why people believe the bullshit?
Yes, there's value in understanding why. I think there's value in understanding what is so compelling to people, and there's a lot of them out there, right? And I know some of them very well, who crave, right? Who crave the BS, who it does something for them. It makes them feel less afraid. It makes them feel less resentful. There are strong psychological motivations for that, and maybe understanding that motivation helps us see them as more human and less as the sort of demonic other, which maybe will lay the foundation for some kind of civil engagement, if that's appropriate. Sometimes you just have to call them on their bullshit, right?
So this is a question that's similar to the one I just asked. Can efforts aimed at a few individuals at a time help American society enough to matter? And this person lists, for example, betterangels.org, which organizes structured conversations among 7 red-leaning Americans and 7 blue-leaning Americans. And sometimes the New York Times writes about these. So I would argue that they're talking about, you know, this is for a lot of people. But does that help, these kinds of structured conversations?
I would just say very quickly, I wouldn't be a teacher if I didn't believe that small groups of, like, that helping small groups of people or individuals understand something about how to be better, understand things better, makes a difference. Right? Otherwise, what are we doing individually in our life? And certainly, what am I doing in a classroom of 20, right? If I didn't think that that was worthwhile work.
Yes, please.
I think that sometimes we get overwhelmed with what's going on in the world, the big world, and in politics, and in Washington, and in government. And we don't have a lot of control in those areas, except we must vote, of course. But all we have control of is our own little corner of the world. So when we're talking about the schools, like, we can have conversations in our families. We can have conversations, we can start with our children when they're young and engage in conversation and engage in critical thinking, and we begin to lay that groundwork and not always depend on somebody else to have to do that. And so I think that small groups of people, one person, can sometimes make a change, but it may not be huge. It may just be in their own little corner of the world.
Going back to some of these questions, Linda, this is, I think, for you. How do you speak to someone who has no facts, doesn't care for your facts, but pulls the emotional card. Well, I feel, or I, from my experience, or I worry.
Well, I'm actually grateful when someone tells me how they're feeling, because for me that's a segue, and I don't have to kind of fiddle around to figure out what that is. So I would just say, wow, you know, I can see that you're feeling really frustrated, or you're really frightened about this, or you're really angry about this, and I have those same feelings myself sometimes. And so let's figure out, well, let's have a conversation about that. When I was training at SECU, I would tell my staff that in order to connect with members who were having problems, and you can imagine people can get very upset if you've lost their money. And so I suggested to the staff is to tap into what the person might be feeling. And I had one particular person say, well, they're not going to like that because I'm telling them how to feel. And I said, well, just try it. You don't have to agree, but would you just be willing to try it? And so this receptionist at one of the branches had a member come in, and he was very upset, and she said to him, wow, that must be really frustrating. If that happened to me, I would be really frustrated about that situation. And he said to her, you're the first person who's ever really understood what it is. And that calmed him down enough for them to then have a logical conversation. So I think feelings is the bridge. I think connecting with people on that gut, visceral feeling is how we build the bridge.
So I looked online for tonight's program, and I saw some good tips, basically, you know, listen, tips that we just heard from all of you. You should listen, be informed yourself, don't label people, don't, avoid ideological rigidity, and don't go to the basement. Do you know what I mean by going to the basement? Casey, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so
going all the way down.
When they go low, we go high.
Yes.
Yeah.
And these are the people who go really low. When someone goes low, does going high actually work effectively? Or do you perhaps lose your temper and become frustrated and go low too? Well, not all of us can be like Michelle Obama.
I think it speaks to, and I think it was something Laura said before, that civility isn't going to solve every problem. That I don't know what the European jury would have thought of the success of civility in stopping the rise of the Third Reich. I think you have to recognize that when civility stops, you have to fall back on the law, and God help us if we ever get to the point where the law isn't enough to maintain the social fabric. So yeah, civility is what we all want to shoot for. It is it's the sign that a society is working well. A civil society is a sign that a society is working well. And when incivility is on the rise, it is a sign of malaise.
Have you, this is also from the audience, have you, any of you heard of the linguist George Lakoff? And do you think reforming our concerns using words our adversaries prefer has the potential of swaying minds?
I just use the phrase tort system, so I think
Right, and your adversary understands those words. I believe he used fairness doctrine.
I think it is important to recognize that words mean different things for different people, different cultures. And it's interesting because I just read this story about Neil Armstrong, and after he had walked on the moon, and he was traveling all over the world, and he was in Japan, and one of the little children said, you know, well, what did you find on the moon? And he said, well, I didn't find a man or any green cheese. And the translator translated it to, I didn't find any rabbits. And that's because in Japan, they don't have any stories about a man in the moon or green cheese. When they look at the moon, as do, I believe, Native Americans, they see a rabbit, a pregnant rabbit. So I think the words we use are important, and I think that it's good to have sort of a common knowledge base with whoever we're having a conversation with so that we're on the same page.
Earlier in the conversation, we were talking about, well, you were talking about fear. And people sometimes communicate from a place of fear. One of the people in the audience said one of the reasons why we are seeing a time of instability can go back to McCarthyism in the 1950s. And people being afraid to speak out or being afraid to say what they really feel or what they really believe in. Does anyone have any comment on this non sequitur?
It's appropriate that we're having this conversation, what is it now, a week now after the death of Philip Roth, who wrote so well about sort of that period in our history, and times when the nation was really kind of coming apart. And I think it's fascinating to me that the line that everyone remembers from the McCarthy era, and really the line that ended in a way the McCarthy era, or at least signaled its end, is have you no sense of decency, sir?
I think about that all the time.
I know, which is just like, when you think of just the power of that line, but of course, if a line like that was used today, it would immediately be gobbled up in a few dozen tweets, and then we would be on to the next outrage. But the power of a single sentence deployed at just the right time to call out incivility, call out lies, call out bullshit is still remarkable, and it's an indicator of the power of civil, modulated language.
Yes.
Years ago, in the 1950s, all your lawyers, to the extent you have lawyers, they were professionals, they were counselors, they were problem solvers, they were wise, and then by the 1990s, they became gladiators in LA law, and the Simpson, all that other stuff. And one of the things that the Bar Association and the Office of Court Administration concluded was that there were no standards of appropriate conduct. Everyone had their own notion of appropriate conduct. And I'm just wondering, could there be, it's a question I guess for others, could there be a code or standards of civility that then we could go home at night, each of us, and sort of read the Times Union and say, well, this clearly is uncivil according to my standards, or is that Pollyannish?
But I think you're talking about professional standards as opposed to more general
interpersonal
societal standards. But I think those standards do exist, and I think you saw it at work today. I think we saw it in the case of Roseanne Barr, that she stepped over a line that ABC immediately recognized as being far too far for anybody who wants to count or wants to stay in the good graces of a multinational communication company can do. And that is why she was cut off immediately. And it wasn't just ABC that was calling her out, it was her colleagues, the other actors on the show, her writers, her former showrunner, all of whom said that she had said something that was unforgivable. So I think that is a sign. If we're looking for a hopeful sign in this discussion, it is that there are still standards and that there are still consequences for that kind of fringe, extreme lack of civility.
And it's unfortunate that somebody like an Alex Jones his message is amplified to such an extent that we've all heard it. Scott, you talk a lot about mediation and that it helps to reduce incivility. And maybe there's something that we can take away from your experiences in mediation?
Well, the bar generally has moved toward mediation, arbitration as well, but mediation, which is they're referred to as alternate dispute forms of resolution. And it's really premised on what you're talking about here today. A mediator has no opinion. A mediator has no power. A mediator cannot conclude who is right and who is wrong. It's just that the parties think that they've been talking past one another. They're each in a closed loop. And maybe, and often it's a judge who directs them to do this, to just sit down, and it's helpful to have an independent third party say, just as both of you have said, is this, I think I hear you saying this. Is that what you're saying? Yes. And I think you hear you saying, and I have, and it's, maybe it's, I'm not a very good, I'm not a strong lawyer, a strong advocate. So mediation for me is, you know, I just think it's a desirable forum to be in. And it doesn't always work. I mean, sometimes there's a schmuck who says, well, I don't care what you say or what it is, I'm going to go out and litigate. But the vast majority of times, you get to hear, it's like you get to hear the jury thinking without going to the expense of impaneling a jury. So I am a fan of that, and maybe your question really is there a mechanism of using an independent third party who has some track record, some credence to when parties are far apart? I mean, I would very much like a third party now to sit between us, and say, well, Scott, is this why you're saying this? Do you have a difficult time? There's times you did not print your name enough. And you might.
So don't get me started.
Right. But I mean, I think it's sometimes, and I might say yes. I find that they ignore me. And so it's a valuable form in my view of resolution.
Lara, this is from the audience. How do I get over the fact that I have no respect for any person who would vote for a person who brags about grabbing women by the genitals, disparages a Gold Star family who happens to be Muslim, and makes fun of disabled people?
So my first answer would be you don't have to. I mean, engaging in civil discourse is a choice, right? So if that is something that you just can't get past, and I totally understand that.
This is a person who votes for
Right.
the person.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So many people in my family voted for that same person. So you know, so you can choose to not engage, and I think we've said, and Linda has said that there are some times when we talked earlier about do I have to compromise my principles, my most deeply felt principles? Well, if you if you don't want to engage in discourse with that person, disengage, I think, is also what you were saying, that life's short and we don't have to try to mediate everything. I think the bigger challenge is, for example, you know, if it is in your family and you do want to engage in civil discourse or you have to, or you're, you know, Thanksgiving is terrible.
You want to have a relationship with your family members.
Exactly. And there have been screaming matches, but not as many as there have been productive discussions. And I think one of the things I found, and I just put this back in the family context, I guess, is that it can start out with the Hannity talking points and but the more you talk, the closer you get to concessions, the closer you get to gray areas, the closer sometimes I feel like they just need to let it all out. And then you can say, if we're talking about welfare, well, you know, actually, the vast majority of people who participate in welfare benefits are children and the elderly. Okay, so we're talking about a smaller group, and then let's look at that group. Most of them are working, even, and we can start to move that direction. I don't know if I answered your question.
No,
I think I did, but
I think you're saying that if you choose to engage because you want to save a relationship, you don't want to close a door,
yeah.
that there are ways to do it,
Yes.
and you need to want to do it. Okay.
Absolutely.
So in the last 15 minutes, let's talk about tools that these people that we can all use, in our day-to-day life to engage in civil discourse when we choose to. Scott, why don't we go on to you? I mean,
Lawyers are a big fan of pregnant clauses.
He's not speaking.
Because the human brain fires approximately 2,000 neurons a second. It fires, and your mouth you can actually speak at, I think, a maximum of 225 words per minute. So you can imagine the delta. Your mind is going crazy, your mouth is catching up, and your ears are simply not working. And sometimes I think that the most effective way of demonstrating both that you dignify what the person is saying and also giving yourself a chance to digest what it is to not say anything. And I just find that at times they just either peter out or they say, well, thank you for listening, and what's your opinion?
Thank you. Linda?
If you are planning on engaging in a conversation that you know is going to be a little testy, like family members who voted for somebody that you didn't vote for, I would prepare myself. And I don't mean to drink a lot of wine. I mean that you sort of prepare yourself emotionally and physically for that. So you don't have that conversation when you're tired or when you're having a bad day, or, so just be in a good place to have the conversation. And when I had that conversation with the person in my family, at that point I chose to say, I just want to hear why. That's all I want to hear. I'm not going to give you my opinion. I'm not going to answer. I'm not going to try to argue the point. All I want to do is understand why, and that's all that happened. I just listened. And I did have a better understanding. Once again, I haven't changed my opinion. But I didn't feel as separated from that person as I had originally. So I think getting yourself mentally and physically prepared for a hard conversation, going into it with the idea that I'm willing to open up my mind and maybe learn something new. Maybe I won't, but I go into it with that intention. I think those are two things that help.
One last postscript. Do we literally have to practice civility?
Well, when I actually did my little civil